Welcome back. Professor Monroe from the Applied Ethics Department again, and in this video we'll be talking about the first of Kant's categorical imperatives, the principle of universality. This principle is really important in Kant's philosophy because not only does it help us make decisions situationally, if we have a choice to make in our real life, but it's also the mechanism whereby Kant thinks that we're able to derive the moral law for ourselves. Remembering that we are autonomous rational beings, Kant gives this principle as a way we can derive the moral law for ourselves and generate the principles to which we are then morally responsible. So, Kant's categorical imperative of universality is as follows. Act only on that maxim which you can at the same time will to be universal law. Now that's a whole lot of jargon going on there, and Kant was known for being a somewhat obscure writer, or infamous for being somewhat obscure. So we're going to have to try to figure out exactly what this means, but to sort of give a simple take on it, what the idea here is expressing, what the principle is expressing, is the idea that if a rule is a good rule, it has to apply to everyone the same way. And if our action is correct, our action has to conform to rules that apply equally across the board to all rational beings. That's the gist of this rule. To get at what he means, though, more fully, we have to analyze this according to four key terms. The first is the word maxim. The second, this very powerful little three-letter word can. The idea of willing, which we briefly discussed in an earlier video, and the idea of what a universal law might look like. So, to start with the idea of a maxim, what does Kant mean by a maxim? Well, maxim is just a fancy, older word for rule or principle or guideline. So candidate maxims might be anything. You should look both ways before crossing the street. One should be honest and return property to a neighbor. Whatever the rule or guideline of action is that's under proposal here. A key idea. Kant believes that whenever we act, we're endorsing a kind of maxim of action. So if I were to tell a lie, what I'm expressing is the idea that it's okay to lie. If I steal, I'm expressing the idea that it's okay to steal, and so on. You get the gist of the idea. Now, what we're testing to see whether or not it could universalize, Kant says, is not our action itself. So I'm considering stealing, let's say. It's not, could everyone steal a loaf of bread if they're hungry or something like that, whatever my particular action is. But could I universalize the rule that my action expresses? So the principle might be something like everyone ought to steal, right? If we look at that more generally. So the maximum of our action is the rule that our action expresses as being okay, given that we're acting that way. And it's that general rule that we're testing to see whether or not that could be a rule that applies to everyone across the board. Now, this question of can implies possibility, right? The word can implies power or ability. So is it within anyone's power that this rule could apply across the board? Basic question here. Kant noted rightly that the word ought implies can, or at least it seems to be noted rightly that ought implies can, that if a rule is going to make any sense at all, it has to be within your power to follow it. For example, if the Florida State Legislature passed a rule that required all students to pass a swim test in order to get a degree, and that swim test meant swimming from Tampa Bay to Cape Horn, Florida wouldn't be granting very many degrees. Why? Because no one can actually live up to that rule. So Kant says basically good rules, rules that make sense, or are rational rules, have to be able to be followed by the people to whom it applies. So what kind of possibility does Kant have in mind here? There are various different kinds of possibility. And to just make it a very short and simple way of expressing it, Kant thinks that if a rule is going to be a good moral rule, it must be logically possible. It must be logically possible or consistent. That is to say, if a maxim could apply across the board to all rational beings, it can't lead to contradiction. If a proposed rule leads to some kind of logical incoherence, then it is not a possible rule for everyone to follow, and therefore it's not a moral law. If the principle is logically consistent, on the other hand, and doesn't lead to contradiction, then it's a good rule, at least it's a candidate for a good rule, and we have a moral obligation to follow it. The idea of willing is tied to the idea of possibility. Willing is a stronger term than desire, or want, or wish, or hope. Willing implies a movement towards action. So think of the term willpower, and you get the basic gist of what willing means here. It's to make yourself act in a certain way. And Kant points out that there's something fundamentally irrational about willing impossible things. You might want impossible things, but you can't actually do anything to bring them about. And if you think about what that means, then there's something fundamentally wrong-headed about trying to will impossible things to occur. For example, if I saw one of my students on the sidewalk with sidewalk chalk trying to draw a triangle with fewer than 3 sides, I would ask, what are you doing? And if the student said, I'm trying to draw a triangle with fewer than 3 sides, I would say, check your head. There's something wrong with the way that you're thinking. So Kant says, we can't will impossible things. We can't want for impossible maxims to be the rule for everybody. Now we've got into that rule for everybody part, the idea of universal law. Here Kant means that all like cases should be treated alike. If a rule applies to one rational being, it has to apply to all rational beings. So, act only on that maxim which you can at the same time will to be universal law comes down to this. If a principle that you're proposing by acting a certain way leads to logical contradiction, it's a bad rule. If that rule doesn't lead to logical contradiction, then it's a good rule, or it's a candidate for a moral law. Let's see how this might work. Suppose that I were contemplating lying to my wife about something, whatever it happens to be is beside the point, but I'm contemplating lying. The maxim that my action would express if I go through with that lie is, if we want to universalize it, would be something like, everyone ought to lie. Is it logically possible that everyone ought to lie all the time, that that should be the general rule of our conduct? And I think Kant rightly points out that the answer there is no. We have to think about what makes lying possible in the first place. Lying crucially depends on there being the concept of trust. You cannot possibly lie to anyone in a world where no one trusts each other. But let's imagine it's the case that everyone ought to lie all the time. What happens to the possibility of trust? Well, if in every exchange or conversation we had, we assume that the person that we were conversing with was lying, what happens to that trust? Well, it vanishes. So the principle, everyone ought to lie, leads to a kind of internal contradiction. That rule can't be the rule that everyone ought to follow, or it leads to its very own impossibility. So from this, Kant says, look, we have a duty to avoid lying, and we conversely have a duty to tell the truth. So that's an example of how this principle works. We use this principle, this idea of universality, to reason our way to the moral law, like thou shalt not lie, thou shalt not steal, and several other candidates. And then we have an obligation to follow those moral laws, regardless of the circumstance, no matter how things turn out. So, in the next video, we'll talk about the second categorical imperative that Kant gives us, the respect for persons rule, which is meant to be a situational decision maker that all of us can use in everyday life.